There is a plant growing right now in a small, stone-walled garden somewhere on the Anatolian plateau that has been fed water in a way most of the Western world has never seen. Not from a hose, not from a watering can tipped over green leaves in the cool of the evening, not even from rain most days. From a buried clay pot, underground. And if you plant garden eggs, the same purple-skinned fruit some of you call eggplant, others call aubergine, others call brinjal, and you water it the way you were taught, the way every gardening blog on the internet tells you to, you will get a plant. You will get fruit. But you will never get what an Anatolian farmer gets from the same seed, in the same soil, under the same sun. Because the difference was never the seed. It was never even the soil. It was the water. And more specifically, where that water goes and where it never should. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how that clay pot works, why it has survived for centuries when modern irrigation systems have come and gone, and how you can use the same principle in your own garden, whether you live on a plateau in central Turkey or in a small backyard 3,000 kilometers away. But to understand the watering, you first have to understand the ground it's buried in, and the people who learned, generation after generation, that some lessons about a plant only reveal themselves after you've already made the mistake once. So let's start where every Anatolian farmer starts, before the seed ever touches soil. Step 1. The ground that decides everything. Long before a garden egg seedling goes into the earth, an Anatolian farmer is already thinking about something most beginner gardeners never consider. Not what to plant, but what was planted there before. In the villages around Konya and further east toward Kayseri, land is rarely left to grow the same crop twice in a row. Garden eggs are heavy feeders. They pull nitrogen and potassium from the soil aggressively, and if you plant them in the same patch of ground 2 seasons running, the second harvest will disappoint you. Smaller fruit, thinner skin, plants that wilt by midsummer no matter how much you water them. This is not folklore. It's simple biology that Anatolian farmers understood long before the word crop rotation existed in any textbook. They just called it resting the ground. A good rule passed down through generations. Garden eggs should never follow potatoes, tomatoes, or peppers in the same plot. All 4 belong to the same plant family, the nightshades, and they share the same pests, the same diseases, the same appetite for the same nutrients. Planting them back to back is like feeding the same exhausted horse the same field of grass a second year and expecting it to run just as fast. Instead, the ground that grew garden eggs last season is given over to legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas. These plants do something remarkable. Their roots host bacteria that pull nitrogen from the air itself and lock it into the soil, replenishing exactly what the garden eggs took out. It's a quiet, patient exchange between 2 completely different plants, separated by a full growing season, that neither one could manage alone. Now, the soil itself. This is where a lot of first-time growers anywhere in the world get it wrong, because they treat soil preparation as an afterthought, something you do the morning you're ready to plant. An Anatolian farmer starts weeks earlier, sometimes an entire season earlier. The plateau soil, especially further inland, tends to be dense, clay-heavy, and slow to drain. Left alone, it holds water in a way that will rot a young garden egg root before it ever gets established. So the ground is opened up. Aged manure, usually from sheep or cattle, never fresh, because fresh manure is too hot and will burn tender roots, is worked into the top layer months before planting season, giving it time to break down and integrate rather than sitting as a shock to the soil. Alongside it, farmers often mix in coarse sand or crushed straw, loosening the density of the clay so that roots can actually push through it instead of fighting. There's a simple test still used today, passed hand to hand rather than written down. Take a fistful of prepared soil, squeeze it, and open your palm. If it holds its shape but crumbles apart with a light touch, it's ready. If it stays packed together like wet clay, it needs more organic matter and more time. If it falls apart before you even squeeze it, it's too sandy and won't hold moisture long enough for the plant's roots to drink from it. This matters more than most people realize because garden eggs are not forgiving plants. They are, by nature, thirsty and slow to forgive neglect, but equally unforgiving of excess. Too little water and the plant stalls. Fruit turns bitter and tough. Too much, sitting in poorly drained clay, and the roots suffocate and rot before you ever see a flower. The entire foundation of a successful harvest is built on getting this balance right before a single seed goes into the ground.
And that brings us to timing, because even perfect soil, planted at the wrong moment, will fail you. Garden eggs are a warm season crop, and Anatolia is a region of sharp seasonal contrasts. Brutal winters, especially at higher elevations, followed by a narrow window of warm, stable weather. Farmers here don't plant by a date on a calendar. They plant by the ground itself. The old measure is this: when the soil, several centimeters down, no longer feels cool to the back of your hand, genuinely warm, not just sun-heated on the surface, the danger of a late frost killing a young seedling has passed. This usually falls sometime in late April to mid-May, depending on the elevation of the village. But the farmers who have worked this land for decades will tell you the calendar lies more often than the soil does. Before you move forward, if you're finding value in understanding how a centuries-old farming tradition solves problems your local garden center never even mentions, this is exactly the kind of forgotten agricultural knowledge this channel exists to preserve. So consider subscribing, because there's a lot more of this still to come. Step 2. The seed and the patience before the field. Here is something that surprises most people. An Anatolian farmer rarely puts a garden egg seed directly into open field soil. Almost never, in fact. The seed goes into a nursery bed first, a smaller, protected patch of soil, often close to the house where it can be watched daily, sometimes even inside a modest greenhouse structure or under a simple cloth cover if the nights are still cool. Why the extra step? Because a garden egg seed is slow and stubborn to germinate, compared to something like a bean or a squash. It needs consistent warmth, soil temperature ideally sitting around 25 to 30 degrees Celsius to sprout reliably. And open field conditions in early spring rarely hold that steady. In a nursery bed, the farmer controls that environment far more precisely. The seed is planted shallow, no deeper than the width of a fingertip, into fine, sifted soil mixed with well-rotted compost, then covered lightly and kept consistently moist, not wet, moist, until germination, which typically takes 7 to 14 days. This is also where the first real test of patience begins, and where many beginner growers, impatient to see results, make their first costly mistake. A garden egg seedling should not leave the nursery bed and go into open ground until it has developed at least 4 to 6 true leaves and a stem sturdy enough to stand upright without support. Move it too early, and the shock of open field conditions, wind, temperature swings, less consistent moisture can stunt the plant permanently. It may survive, but it will never fully recover its vigor. This single mistake, more than almost any other, is why some home gardeners plant garden eggs and end up with a handful of small, disappointing fruit, while a neighbor with seemingly identical conditions gets a full, generous harvest. The difference wasn't luck. It was restraint. When the seedling is finally ready, the transplanting itself follows a rhythm that's been refined over generations. It happens in the late afternoon or early evening, never under the direct heat of midday sun, to reduce transplant shock. The seedling is watered thoroughly an hour or so before being moved, so the root ball stays intact and moist rather than crumbling apart in the farmer's hands. Spacing matters more than most beginners expect. Plants set too close together compete for the same water and nutrients underground, resulting in smaller fruit across the board. The traditional spacing on Anatolian plots runs roughly 60 centimeters between plants, with rows spaced even wider, close to 70 centimeters apart, giving each plant room to spread and giving the farmer room to walk between rows without disturbing the roots. And then, almost immediately after transplanting, comes the step that separates the ordinary harvest from the exceptional one. The step in the title of this video, the water. Step 3. The buried clay pot. If you search online for how to water a garden eggplant, you'll find the same advice repeated everywhere. Water at the base, not the leaves. Water in the morning. Keep the soil consistently moist. All of this is true, None of it is wrong. But it is incomplete, and it misses the single technique that Anatolian farmers have relied on for longer than anyone alive today can trace. It's called olla irrigation in some parts of the world. In Anatolian villages, farmers simply call it Testi Sulama, pot watering. And it works on a principle so old, it predates any modern irrigation system by well over 2,000 years. Here's how it works. Before or immediately after transplanting the seedling, the farmer takes an unglazed clay pot, the kind of rough, porous earthenware that has been made in this region for generations, and buries it in the soil directly beside the young plant, close enough that the plant's roots will eventually grow toward it, with only the neck of the pot exposed above ground. The pot is then filled with water, and its opening is covered, sometimes with a flat stone or a piece of wood, to slow evaporation from the top. Because the clay is unglazed and porous, the water inside doesn't just sit there. It slowly, steadily seeps outward through the walls of the pot directly into the surrounding soil. Not in a sudden flood the way a hose or watering can delivers water, but in a slow, continuous seep that matches almost exactly the rate at which a plant's roots can actually absorb moisture. This solves two problems that trouble almost every other watering method at once. First, it delivers water directly to the root zone, several centimeters below the surface, rather than to the topsoil, where much of it simply evaporates in the heat before the roots ever benefit from it. And Anatolian summers, particularly across the central plateau, are dry and intense enough that surface watering can lose a significant portion of its value to evaporation within hours. Second, because the moisture release is slow and steady rather than a sudden soak, the roots never experience the flood-then-drought cycle that comes from watering once every few days with a hose. Instead, they experience something closer to a light, steady rain that never actually stops, a consistency that garden eggs, with their sensitivity to both overwatering and underwatering, respond to with dramatically stronger and more resilient growth. There's a second, quieter benefit that took generations of observation to notice and confirm. Because the water stays below the surface rather than sitting on top of the soil, the top layer of ground around the plant stays relatively dry. Weed seeds, which need surface moisture to germinate, struggle to establish themselves. Farmers using this method consistently report far less weeding required around their garden eggs compared to plants watered conventionally. One small, patient adjustment to how water is delivered, solving a problem that has nothing directly to do with water at all. The pots are refilled every few days, depending on the heat of the season. Daily during the peak of a hot, dry July, less often in cooler weeks. And the farmer simply checks the water level by looking into the neck of the pot rather than guessing based on the appearance of the soil surface, which, as we just established, tells you very little about what's actually happening at root depth. If you don't have access to unglazed clay pots, there's a version of this principle you can adapt almost anywhere. A simple plastic bottle, several small holes pierced into its lower half, buried neck up beside the plant, and filled with water periodically, mimics the same slow-release effect, though far less elegantly and without the natural porosity of real clay. It won't perform quite as well, but it will outperform surface watering every time, particularly through the hottest weeks of the growing season. Now the plant is in the ground, watered in a way most gardeners have never even heard of. But growing a garden egg successfully doesn't end there, and this next part is where a lot of otherwise careful gardeners still lose a portion of their harvest without ever understanding why. Step 4. What happens between planting and harvest? As the plant establishes itself and begins to grow, an Anatolian farmer is watching for a handful of specific things, most of which have nothing to do with the fruit itself yet. The first is flowering. Garden eggplants produce small, star-shaped purple flowers, and not every flower becomes fruit. In fact, a healthy plant will often drop a portion of its early flowers entirely. This is normal, not a sign of failure, and panicking over it is one of the more common mistakes among first-time growers who assume every dropped flower represents a lost fruit. The plant is simply directing its energy toward the flowers it can actually support. What matters is consistency of care through this stage, steady moisture from the buried pot, and crucially, steady nutrition.
Around 4 to 6 weeks after transplanting, once the plant is clearly established and beginning to flower, a second feeding is introduced, typically a diluted application of aged manure tea, made by steeping well-rotted manure in water for several days and then applying the strained liquid around the base of the plant. This gives the plant a boost of nutrients right at the moment it needs them most, as it shifts from simply growing leaves and stem to producing and sustaining fruit, which is a far more energy-intensive process for the plant. Pruning is the next piece most beginner gardeners skip entirely, assuming a plant should simply be left to grow however it wants. Anatolian farmers disagree, and their harvests tend to prove them right. As the plant grows, the lowest branches and any leaves touching or close to the soil are removed. This improves air circulation around the base of the plant, which matters enormously in preventing fungal disease, a serious risk for garden eggs, particularly in humid stretches of weather, since poor air circulation around damp lower leaves is one of the most common causes of disease in this crop. It also redirects the plant's energy upward toward the branches that will actually bear fruit, rather than wasting resources on foliage close to the ground that contributes little. Pests, inevitably, are part of the story too. And here again, the traditional approach favors prevention over reaction. Garden eggs attract particular attention from flea beetles and aphids. Rather than reaching for any kind of chemical spray, Anatolian farmers have long relied on companion planting, placing garden eggs near strong-scented herbs like basil or marigold, whose scent actively confuses and repels many common pests before they ever become a serious problem. It's a method that requires more planning at the very beginning, when the garden layout is first being decided, but far less intervention later, which is precisely the trade most experienced farmers are willing to make. Through all of this, the plant is also staked or supported as it grows taller, particularly once it begins carrying the weight of developing fruit. A simple wooden stake, driven into the ground beside the plant and tied loosely with soft twine, prevents the stem from bending or snapping under the weight of a heavy, healthy harvest, which, if you followed everything up to this point, is exactly what you should expect. There's one more layer to this stage that ties directly back to the buried clay pot, and it's the kind of detail that rarely makes it into a general gardening guide, because it only makes sense once you understand the watering method underneath it. Around the base of each plant, once it's a few weeks established, farmers lay down a layer of mulch, dried straw most commonly, sometimes chopped dry grass or even crushed sun-dried leaves left over from the previous autumn. This isn't decorative. Its purpose is to slow surface evaporation even further, protecting the small amount of moisture that does reach the topsoil, while also moderating soil temperature during the harshest stretch of summer afternoons, when bare, exposed soil on the plateau can heat up enough to stress shallow feeder roots near the surface. The mulch is kept a small distance back from the stem itself, never piled directly against it, since constant contact between damp mulch and the stem can invite rot at the base of the plant. A small, easily overlooked detail that separates a thriving plant from one that quietly weakens over the season without an obvious cause. Between the buried pot working steadily below the surface and the mulch layer protecting what little moisture escapes above it, the plant spends the hottest, driest weeks of the Anatolian summer in conditions far gentler than the surrounding, exposed soil around it. A small, deliberate microclimate built entirely from materials already sitting on the farm, costing nothing beyond the time it took to learn the method in the first place. Step 5. Knowing when to harvest. This is a stage where impatience costs people more than almost any other mistake in the entire process. Because a garden egg fruit that looks ready and a garden egg fruit that actually is ready are not always the same thing. The instinct for most people is to judge readiness by size. This is the wrong measure entirely. The real test, the one Anatolian farmers rely on, is the skin. A ready garden egg has skin that is firm, glossy, and taut. When you press it gently with a thumb, it should spring back almost immediately, leaving no lasting indentation. If the flesh stays dimpled after you press it, the fruit has gone past its prime, and the texture inside will already be turning tough, seedy, and noticeably more bitter.
If the skin still gives too easily and looks dull rather than glossy, it needs more time.
Color is a secondary clue, but a less reliable one on its own, because it varies by variety. Some traditional Anatolian garden egg varieties stay a deep, almost black purple at full ripeness, while others take on a lighter, striped appearance even when fully mature. This is exactly why relying on color alone misleads so many new growers who are used to a single, uniform variety from a supermarket shelf and don't realize how much natural variation exists among heirloom types still grown across different regions of Anatolia. Harvesting itself is done with a sharp knife or pruning shears, never by pulling or twisting the fruit free by hand. The stem is tough and fibrous, and forcing it can tear the branch, damaging the plant and reducing its ability to produce further fruit for the rest of the season. A clean cut, leaving a short piece of stem attached to the fruit, is both gentler on the plant and better for the fruit's storage life afterward. And here's something worth pausing on. A healthy, well-tended garden eggplant, grown this way, doesn't give you one harvest. It gives you a rolling, continuous one. As long as you continue harvesting regularly, every few days once fruit starts maturing, the plant keeps producing new flowers and new fruit for weeks, sometimes months through the warm season. Let too much fruit sit and over-ripen on the plant, however, and it sends a signal to redirect energy towards seed production rather than new fruit, effectively shortening your entire harvest window. Regular, attentive picking isn't just about enjoying fresh fruit sooner, it's what keeps the plant producing at all. Step 6. After the harvest, what most gardeners never do. The growing season ends, the last fruit is picked, and for most home gardeners, that's where the story stops. The plant is pulled up, the bed is cleared, and everyone moves on to whatever comes next. This is precisely where the Anatolian approach diverges one final time, and it's a difference that shapes next year's harvest before this year's has even finished. First, seed saving. If you've grown a variety worth repeating, and most farmers here are growing the same heirloom varieties their grandparents grew, seeds passed down rather than repurchased each year, a few of the healthiest, most vigorous fruits are deliberately left on the plant well past normal harvest time, allowed to fully over-ripen until the skin turns dull, yellowish-brown, and starts to soften significantly. This is the opposite of what you'd do for eating, and that's exactly the point. A fruit left to over-ripen this way is a fruit whose seeds have had the maximum time to fully mature and develop the strongest germination potential for next season. The seeds are then scooped out, rinsed clean of the surrounding pulp, and dried thoroughly on a cloth or paper in a shaded, well-ventilated spot for at least a week before being stored in a cool, dry place until next spring's nursery bed. Second, the ground itself. Remember part 1, where we talked about resting the soil and rotating crops? This is where that cycle actually begins. Once the plant is finally pulled at the end of the season, the roots and any remaining plant material are typically composted rather than discarded, returning at least some of what the plant drew from the soil back into the broader cycle of the farm, and the bed is marked, mentally or literally, as ground that will rest from nightshades for at least the next 2 growing seasons. And the clay pot, buried quietly beside where the plant once stood, it's dug up, cleaned, and set aside, ready for next year, having done its slow, patient work with no fanfare at all. There's something worth sitting with here, beyond the soil and the seeds and the buried clay pot. Every single decision in this process, the crop rotation, the nursery bed, the spacing, the pruning, the watering method, most of the world has never seen, exists because someone, generations ago, made a mistake, paid attention to why it happened, and passed the correction down to the next person who would plant that same seed in that same ground. None of it was written in a manual first. It was lived, observed, and remembered, long before it was ever spoken into a video like this one. That buried pot beside the plant isn't just a clever trick for saving water. It's a small, quiet piece of evidence that some of the best solutions were never lost. They were just never loud enough to reach everyone. And now that you know exactly how it works and why it works, you're carrying forward something that very nearly stayed confined to a small stretch of farmland on the Anatolian plateau. If this is the kind of forgotten, tested by generations knowledge you want more of, subscribe.
Because there are dozens of these traditions still waiting to be told. One plant, one field, one quiet piece of wisdom at a time.